The central Atlantic Ocean is wide enough to erase a person's sense of scale. In every direction, water extends beyond the horizon, broken only by the movement of waves and the slow shift of cloud cover. In wartime, this emptiness was not peaceful. It was simply indifferent. By 1942, the Atlantic had become one of the most heavily contested spaces on Earth. Merchant ships crossed it in long routes between the Americas, Africa, and Europe, carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and raw materials. Their journeys were defined by distance and routine, but also by constant risk. The ocean was not only deep and unpredictable, it was patrolled. Submarines operated far from shore, hunting vessels that moved through the shipping lanes. Many sinkings happened quickly, without warning, leaving little time for organized evacuation. In the open sea, survival often depended on what could be reached in seconds: a raft, a life jacket, a tin of biscuits, a container of water. Even when a person escaped the initial disaster, the ocean offered no further guarantees. A raft could drift for days without crossing another ship's path. A single storm could overturn it. Sun and salt could weaken the body faster than hunger. The sea could keep a survivor alive and destroy them at the same time. In late 1942, one such crossing was underway. A merchant vessel sailed alone, without escort, moving through waters where many ships had already vanished. It was an ordinary voyage in an extraordinary year. On board was a man named Poon Lim, a civilian sailor with no rank, no authority, and no reason to expect that within hours, he would become one of the most isolated survivors of the war. Poon Lim was born in China in 1918, in an era when the country was marked by political instability, economic hardship, and the growing pressure of foreign conflict. Many families lived with limited security, and for young men, work often meant leaving home. Coastal regions and port cities offered opportunities tied to maritime trade, and seafaring became one of the few ways to earn a stable income while also seeing the world beyond local borders. Lim's early life is not documented in extensive personal detail, but the outline of his path is clear. He eventually left China and went to Hong Kong, which at the time was a major British-controlled port and a hub of international shipping. Hong Kong's docks were busy and dangerous, filled with cargo vessels and merchant crews who moved between continents with little public recognition. For men like Lim, maritime work was demanding but practical. It offered wages, food, and a predictable structure in a world that was increasingly unpredictable. He became a sailor in the merchant service. This was not glamorous work. Merchant crews handled cargo, maintained equipment, and lived in cramped conditions for weeks or months at a time. The pay could vary, and the risks were constant even in peacetime: storms, accidents, illness, and mechanical failures. But merchant shipping was essential to global trade, and the people who worked on these ships were a quiet workforce supporting international economies. When the Second World War expanded across continents, merchant seamen became part of the conflict without formally being soldiers. Their ships carried supplies that directly supported military operations. That made them targets. German U-boats, operating across the Atlantic, sought to cut Britain's supply lines. A merchant vessel could be sunk as easily as a naval ship, and the men aboard often had less protection, fewer defenses, and limited rescue options. Lim was not a British citizen, but like many Chinese seamen at the time, he worked on British ships because British shipping companies recruited heavily from Asian ports. Chinese sailors were valued for their labor, though they were often treated as a lower tier of crew, with fewer privileges and less recognition than European seamen. Despite this, their work remained vital. At some point before 1942, Lim joined the crew of a British merchant ship called the SS Ben Lomond. The Ben Lomond was a cargo vessel built in the early 20th century, part of Britain's merchant fleet. By wartime standards it was not unusual, a large ship designed to transport goods over long distances. It was not a warship. Its job was not to fight, but to move cargo where it was needed. Lim's position aboard the ship was as a steward, meaning his responsibilities were largely domestic rather than mechanical. A steward served officers and crew by preparing food, maintaining living quarters, and handling daily routines that kept ship life functioning. It was work that required discipline and attention, but not necessarily technical training. Still, life at sea taught certain practical habits: conserving resources, understanding weather, and enduring isolation for long periods. By late 1942, the war had intensified across the Atlantic. Sinkings were frequent. Merchant crews knew the risks even if they did not speak openly about them. Some ships traveled in convoys protected by escorts, but others sailed alone, either due to scheduling, cargo urgency, or lack of available protection. The SS Ben Lomond was one of those ships. In November 1942, it was crossing the Atlantic, moving through waters where German submarines were actively hunting. It carried cargo and crew, operating under the quiet assumption that if something happened, it would happen suddenly. There would be no time to debate choices. There would only be instinct and whatever the sea allowed. For Poon Lim, the voyage began as routine. He was one sailor among many, doing his assigned work, living through the ordinary repetition of ship life. But in wartime, routine was fragile. It could disappear in a single moment. On November 23, 1942, the SS Ben Lomond was in the mid-Atlantic, traveling alone. The ship was unescorted, moving through waters where German submarines had been steadily dismantling Allied merchant traffic. For many crews, this was the most feared condition: open ocean, no nearby protection, no immediate help if the ship was struck. That day, a German U-boat located the Ben Lomond. The submarine was U-172, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Karl Emmermann. It was part of the German campaign to sever Britain's supply lifelines. Merchant ships like the Ben Lomond were considered legitimate and valuable targets. They carried cargo. They also carried morale. The attack came with little warning. A torpedo hit the ship, and the damage was catastrophic. The Ben Lomond began to sink rapidly. Accounts indicate the ship went down in a matter of minutes. For the crew, this left almost no time to organize an evacuation. Lifeboats could not always be lowered in an orderly way during such sudden destruction, and in some sinkings, the force of the explosion or the speed of flooding made escape nearly impossible. Poon Lim was on board when the torpedo struck. He later described the chaos as immediate and overwhelming. The ship was breaking apart. Men were trying to reach the deck. Some were likely killed instantly by the explosion or trapped below. In that kind of sinking, survival often depends on chance, being in the right place at the right moment, reaching open air before corridors fill with smoke or water, and finding something that floats. Lim made it off the ship. He entered the water and managed to locate a Carly float, a type of life raft commonly used on ships during the war. These floats were designed to remain buoyant even when damaged, and they often carried emergency supplies. They were not comfortable, but they were stable enough to keep survivors above water. He climbed aboard. When the ship disappeared, it took the rest of the crew with it. No organized rescue followed. There was no convoy to witness the sinking and send assistance. The Atlantic swallowed the wreckage and became quiet again, as if nothing had happened. Lim was left alone on the surface of the ocean, surrounded by floating debris that would soon drift away or sink. The horizon offered no land and no ships. The sea around him was wide and empty. The moment the Ben Lomond vanished below the waterline, his situation changed completely. He was no longer part of a crew. He was no longer on a voyage. He was simply a man on a raft, drifting. The Carly float that Poon Lim climbed onto was designed for emergencies, not for extended living. It was a rigid ring-like structure with a netted or flat interior section that could support survivors in the water. It provided buoyancy and a small measure of stability, but it was exposed on all sides. There were no walls, no cabin, no protection from wind, rain, or sun. The raft's value was simple: it kept him above the surface. In the first hours after the sinking, Lim had to stabilize himself physically and mentally. The water around him was still scattered with debris, but the ocean does not hold things together for long. Objects separate quickly, carried in different directions by wind and current. If he was going to secure supplies, he needed to do it immediately. He searched what was within reach and found emergency items stored with the raft. According to accounts later recorded, he had access to basic survival provisions, a small amount of water, biscuits, chocolate, and possibly condensed milk. There were also practical tools, most importantly a knife, a flashlight, and flares. These supplies were meant to keep someone alive long enough for rescue, perhaps a few days. They were not intended for weeks. Lim had no way of knowing how long he would drift. The Atlantic shipping lanes were active, but that did not mean ships would pass close enough to notice him. A raft is a small object on a large sea. Even when a vessel passes within a few miles, it may not see a person unless the conditions are perfect. His first decision was to ration. He understood quickly that food was not the most urgent problem. Water was. In open sun and salt wind, dehydration becomes fatal long before starvation. Even with some drinking water on board, he could not consume it freely. If rescue did not come quickly, the supply would be gone. He began drinking in controlled amounts. Small sips. Deliberate timing. The goal was not comfort, but survival. Lim reduced movement during the hottest parts of the day to limit sweating. He tried to keep his body as cool as possible with the limited shade available. He used parts of the raft structure to create minimal cover, though it could not block the sun for long. The next major problem was the ocean itself. Salt water is everywhere, but it cannot be consumed. Drinking it accelerates dehydration and can cause confusion, vomiting, and organ failure. A survivor surrounded by water is still at risk of dying from thirst. Lim needed a method of collecting rain. When rain came, he used whatever containers or fabric he had to gather it. Reports indicate he used a canvas sheet or similar material from the raft supplies. Even a small amount of rainfall could provide critical relief. In storms, he could collect enough to refill containers. In dry periods, he had to endure long stretches with almost nothing. Food became the second long-term issue. The biscuits and chocolate would not last. Even if he ate nothing, they would eventually become soaked or spoiled. He needed protein, fat, and sustained calories. In the open ocean, there are fish. There are also birds. The problem is capturing them without proper equipment. At first, he relied on what was available. The raft had some rope, and he began improvising. A knife could cut rope into strands. With patience, he could braid or tie it into lines. Hooks were more difficult. He had no fishing hooks. But metal could be shaped. If he had nails, wires, or pieces of equipment from the raft, he could bend them into crude hooks. If not, he would have to rely on other methods. Lim began fishing with makeshift tools. He used pieces of biscuit or other scraps as bait. Eventually, he succeeded in catching small fish. Once he had fish, he had more bait. Fish guts could attract larger fish. The ocean, if approached carefully, could provide a chain of resources. He also learned to catch seabirds. Birds would occasionally land on the raft, attracted by rest or curiosity. Lim waited for them, moving slowly, conserving energy, and then striking when they were close. He killed them with his hands or with tools available. It was not easy. A bird is quick and fragile. Missing the moment meant wasting energy. But when he caught them, they provided more than meat. Their blood could be consumed for hydration and nutrients. Their bones could be sharpened into tools. Their feathers could be used as insulation or padding. Even waste became valuable. He ate what he could. Some of the fish and bird meat was eaten raw, because he had no way to make fire. Raw fish carries risks, parasites, illness, spoilage. But in survival conditions, the immediate need for calories often outweighs long-term risk. Lim had no other choice. He also had to manage the physical environment of the raft. Salt water constantly soaked his skin. The sun burned it. The raft's surface rubbed against his body. Over time, this causes sores, infection, and tissue breakdown. These injuries can become serious even if they appear minor. Salt in open wounds causes constant pain and slows healing. To reduce this, Lim tried to keep himself as dry as possible, though full dryness was impossible. He adjusted his posture. He used fabric as a barrier between his skin and the raft. When rain came, he washed salt from his body and clothes. This was not only for comfort but for preventing skin deterioration. The days were shaped by basic cycles: sunlight, wind, and waves. In calm weather, the raft drifted steadily, rocking gently. In rough weather, it became unstable, with waves washing over it and threatening to throw him into the sea. Falling off the raft could be fatal. Climbing back on is difficult, especially when weakened. In storms, the raft could overturn. If it flipped, the survivor might not be able to right it. Lim learned to secure himself. He used rope to lash his body or his limbs to the raft during rough seas. This reduced the risk of being swept away. It also meant enduring hours of cold water breaking over him, unable to move freely, while holding on and waiting for the sea to settle. He also faced sharks. Sharks are common in the open ocean. They are attracted to movement and blood. Lim later reported that sharks circled the raft at times. A small raft does not protect against them. If he fell into the water, he would be vulnerable. If he tried to fish, he risked drawing them closer. He used a knife or improvised spear to defend himself when necessary. If a shark came too close, he struck at it. The goal was not to kill it, but to discourage it. Sharks often retreat if they encounter resistance, especially if the prey seems difficult. Still, the constant presence of predators added strain. It forced Lim to remain alert even when exhausted. One of the most difficult aspects of drifting is the absence of control. Lim could not steer in any meaningful way. The raft moved where currents and wind carried it. He could attempt to use fabric as a sail, but this offered limited direction. The Atlantic currents could pull him far off course, and he had no map, no compass, and no way to know where he was. At times, he may have seen distant ships. Some accounts indicate he did encounter ships or aircraft but was not rescued. In wartime, this was not unusual. Merchant ships were under strict orders not to stop for survivors if doing so risked submarine attack. A ship that slowed down or changed course could become a target. Many captains made the decision to continue rather than stop. Lim also had limited signaling ability. Flares were valuable but finite. Using one at the wrong moment would waste it. A flare could be seen only if a ship was close enough and looking in the right direction. In daylight, a flare is less effective. At night, it is more visible, but ships may not pass nearby. He had to make decisions about when to signal. Each flare represented hope but also a trade-off. Once used, it was gone. Time on the ocean does not pass evenly. Without routine social markers, work schedules, conversation, changing scenery, days blur. The only measure becomes the sun rising and setting. Lim likely counted days by watching the sky, estimating the passage of time by light and darkness. But exhaustion and dehydration distort perception. A survivor can lose track of how long they have been adrift. To maintain discipline, he created structure. This was one of the most important survival tools he had. Even with no one watching, he set rules: when to eat, when to drink, when to fish. Without rules, he might consume supplies too quickly. Without routine, despair could set in. He also had to manage sleep. Sleep in an exposed raft is fragmented. Waves constantly jolt the body. Wind and rain interrupt rest. The fear of falling overboard keeps the mind alert. In the open ocean, deep sleep is rare. Lim slept in short periods, waking often. His body remained in a state of tension. Over weeks, this erodes physical strength and mental stability. The mind becomes slower. Decision-making becomes harder. Yet he continued to adapt. His fishing improved. He learned which methods worked and which wasted energy. He used fish remains to attract larger fish. He used bird bones to shape better hooks. Over time, his raft became a small survival platform built from scavenged parts and improvised tools. He also faced long stretches of empty water. Days where nothing was caught. Days without rain. During those periods, he returned to his emergency biscuits and small reserves, using them sparingly. He could not let panic drive him to consume everything. He had to accept hunger as a constant presence. The physical consequences were gradual. His body began to lose weight. Muscle weakened. Skin cracked. Salt sores formed. The sun damaged his face and hands. His eyes strained from constant brightness. But his survival methods were working. At some point, he drifted into warmer waters. The sea temperature changed. The pattern of birds and fish shifted. This suggested he was moving southward, perhaps toward the equatorial Atlantic or toward the currents leading to South America. But he could not be sure. The raft carried him on. As the weeks passed, his existence became narrow and repetitive: wake, check the sky, scan the horizon, fish, collect water if rain appeared, eat carefully, defend against sharks, repair what could be repaired, and wait. Waiting was not passive. It required effort. It required staying alive long enough for chance to intersect with a passing ship. The Atlantic is full of movement, but it rarely reveals that movement to someone low on the surface. A raft sits almost at water level. Waves can hide it. Sun glare can erase it. Even if a ship passed a mile away, Lim might not see it clearly. Even if he did, he might not have the strength to signal effectively. And yet, he remained on the raft, continuing the same deliberate work each day, because the alternative was simple. If he stopped, the ocean would finish the job the torpedo had begun. As the drift continued, survival became less about invention and more about endurance. The raft was still afloat, and Lim still had ways to catch food and collect rainwater, but time itself became a pressure. Every day increased the chances of infection, injury, and irreversible physical decline. The human body can adapt to hunger, but not without cost. Lim's diet was inconsistent. Some days he caught fish or managed to kill a seabird. Other days he ate very little. Without steady calories, the body begins consuming its own reserves. Weight drops quickly. Muscles weaken. The ability to grip, lift, and balance becomes less reliable. For someone on a raft, even small weakness can become dangerous. A slip could mean falling into the water. A moment of fatigue could mean missing the chance to secure a tool or food source. The sun was another steady enemy. Without shade, Lim's skin was exposed for hours each day. Saltwater kept his clothes damp, and wet fabric against skin caused chafing. Sores formed. The combination of salt, sunburn, and open wounds created a slow deterioration that could not be treated properly. He could rinse with rainwater when it came, but he could not prevent the ocean from soaking him again. Dehydration remained a constant threat. Even when he had rainwater, it was never enough to drink freely. Dry spells forced him to return to strict rationing. The sensation of thirst in the open sea is not brief. It becomes a continuous discomfort that affects attention and judgment. Prolonged dehydration can cause dizziness, weakness, and confusion. It can also make a person reckless, tempting them to drink seawater despite knowing the consequences. Lim resisted that impulse, but the strain accumulated. A survivor can endure pain and discomfort for days, but weeks of exposure change the mind. Time stretches. Sleep becomes lighter. The body loses its normal rhythm. Hunger and thirst become background conditions rather than temporary problems. There were also moments of false hope. At least once during his drift, Lim encountered the presence of other vessels. Accounts indicate that a ship passed close enough for him to attempt signaling. Whether he used a flare or simply waved and shouted, he was not rescued. In wartime, ships often avoided stopping. Even if they saw him, they may have judged the risk too high. A stationary ship was vulnerable to submarines, and captains were trained to keep moving. For someone on a raft, watching a ship pass without stopping could be psychologically damaging. It was evidence that rescue was possible, but also that rescue could be denied. The ocean was no longer purely empty, it was indifferent in a different way. Help could exist and still not arrive. The raft itself continued to drift, battered by changing weather. Storms brought rain, which meant water, but storms also meant danger. Rough seas could slam the raft and throw Lim against its structure. The cold rain, combined with wind, could lower body temperature even in relatively warm waters. Hypothermia is not limited to polar regions, prolonged wet exposure can exhaust the body anywhere. By the later part of his drift, Lim's strength had diminished noticeably. His movements became slower. His body carried the visible signs of prolonged malnutrition. His skin was damaged. His clothing was degraded. The raft's surface was his entire world, and it offered no relief. At some point, he began to see signs that he might be nearing land, changes in the color of the water, different patterns of birds, floating vegetation. These are indicators sailors recognize, but they are not guarantees. Ocean currents can carry debris far from shore. A person can believe land is close and still drift for many more days. Lim continued to fish, continued to ration, continued to hold on to the raft through the nights. By the time he approached the end of the 47 days, survival had become fragile. He was still alive, but he was no longer strong. His situation depended on one final factor beyond his control, whether another human being would actually see him before his body reached its limit. On the 47th day, Poon Lim's drift brought him within sight of the Brazilian coast. The currents and wind that had carried him across the Atlantic now placed him near land, though the approach was slow and uncertain. From a distance, he would have appeared as a small, motionless figure on the ocean surface, nearly level with the water, difficult to detect even for an observant observer. Lim was finally spotted by local fishermen. They had been working along the coast, tending nets and small boats, when they noticed the outline of the raft. The sight was unusual enough to warrant investigation. The fishermen approached cautiously, bringing their boat alongside. Lim, weak and physically diminished, remained on the raft. He had not been able to control his drift, but he had retained the strength to stay aboard until assistance arrived. The rescue was quiet. He was lifted onto the small fishing vessel, his body still functional but fragile. Lim had lost significant weight, and his skin showed signs of prolonged sun exposure and salt irritation. His eyes reflected exhaustion, but he was alive. There were no dramatic celebrations, no immediate medical interventions beyond stabilizing him with food and water. The focus was on ensuring he remained upright and hydrated while being brought to shore. Once ashore, he received basic care. He was examined by medical personnel who noted the extent of dehydration and malnutrition. He did not suffer major permanent physical injury, aside from the expected weight loss and skin damage. Lim's survival was confirmed not through spectacle, but through simple observation. He had endured 47 days adrift in the open Atlantic, relying entirely on his own resourcefulness and discipline. Poon Lim's survival became a documented case in maritime history. During a period when merchant shipping faced constant danger, his experience demonstrated both the fragility and resilience of human life at sea. His methods, rationing, fishing, rainwater collection, and disciplined daily routines, provided practical insights for survival training and emergency planning. While many sailors were lost in similar circumstances, Lim's endurance offered a rare record of sustained isolation and self-reliance. Historians and survival specialists have referenced his drift as an example of careful observation, improvisation, and the human capacity to maintain routine under extreme stress. There was no spectacle, no dramatic return. The Atlantic simply returned him to human contact, allowing him to resume life on land. 47 days had passed, and the open ocean, vast and indifferent, released him. His story endures quietly, a testament to adaptation, patience, and the narrow margin between life and the sea.